Lee Lowenfish, welcome to the Bookshelf Conversation.
Nice to be with you, Ron, on the day before opening day.
A day
Good
that
timing.
fans have been looking forward to for quite a while. Your book, "Baseball's Endangered Species: Inside the Craft of Scouting by Those Who Lived It," is. Uh, I've always liked the behind the scenes stuff, and I think that especially younger fans might have an impression of scouts by what they saw in the movie Moneyball, which is a bunch of old, out of date guys sitting around a table spouting nonsense in the face of modern analytics. But yours gives due to the gentlemen, and I assume they're like 99.9% gentlemen who did the scouting in those days.
Well, Ron, I'm really pleased that the last part of my book talks about the late Kelly Rodman, who uh, was a Yankee scout and a real comer. We have two pictures of her in the book. She was such a comer in the organization that when they televised the scout draft, she was pictured with Nick Swisher. We have that picture in the book, and another one with her boss, Damon Oppenheimer. And unfortunately, she passed away 3 years ago at the age of 44 from
Oh my.
brain cancer. And there have been big stories about her role in pushing for Anthony Volpe, so who will be starting shortstop for the Yankees this year. So baseball, and this is one thing where Commissioner Manfred is really pushing for more women in the game. I'm glad I told Kelly Rodman's story, but historically, Ron, you're absolutely right. It was, with the exception of a rare exception of Edith Houghton with the Phillies after World War II, and Lois Brandenburg, who brought Tom Poquette into the game for the Royals. It has been a men's sport, but as you said, Moneyball, both the book and the movie, was very uh, inaccurate, and worse than that, it cost dozens of scouts their jobs. And
Not
that's one of the reasons I was happy and determined to do this book.
the image I get of when you reading about the older scouts, there are the two movies come to mind: the Stratton Story with Frank Morgan as Barney Weil, and Pride of the Yankees with Walter Brennan as Sam Blake, who is also a newspaper man. How was that common? I can't imagine it was common that a newspaper man would be a scout. I know they took liberties with these
Well, yeah,
films.
that was. I'm glad you mentioned those films, because I'm really into the baseball films of the 40s and 50s. I'm talking at Cooperstown in early June about the Angels in the Outfield, which is a fairly forgotten film, and it's not the remake with Danny Glover, but it's the original one. The Walter Brennan character was a total creation. It was Critchell who signed Gehrig, and I have that story in my book. In fact, the end of April will be the 100th anniversary of Critchell signing Gehrig. First, he saw him at Rutgers, then he saw him at Columbia when they were playing at 116th Street, not yet up at Baker Field. And by the end of the month of April 1923, Gehrig has become Yankee property. But one of the challenges of doing this book, Ron, is that scouts did rarely talk to the press, and they were encouraged not to talk to the press. And so I did a lot of digging in the old journals like the Sporting News and local newspapers, when occasionally stories were were written about scouts. But I also have the story in the book about the first amateur draft here in New York, at the Roosevelt Hotel. And there were almost fistfights among the scouts when the first draft occurred, because scouts were so, in the old days, they went they were individualists, and they were not above giving wrong information about where a prospect might be playing because they wanted that person. And at the very first amateur draft in 1965, there was almost a fist fight because Giant scout and scouting director Jack Schwartz was, "You took my player," and they told him, calm down. I mean, it's not your player anymore. There's every team has a shot now in the draft. So for many years, they did the draft by phone to keep that incident from happening again. Now, of course, it's a TV extravaganza. But um, uh, my whole motive in doing the book was to give homage to these people who uh, had lives of travel. I mean, spent most of the year on the road, but they were dreaming of finding the next Gehrig or the next arm behind the barn. And in many cases, they did find them. And to this day, some of the best scouts who have survived in the game are always exhorting their associates and the rising scouts. The future Hall of Famer has not been found. You find them.
Hmm.
And so that's where these stories, I hope the readers will enjoy when they get to them.
Now, I must admit, I do not know the names of most of the scouts in this book. Pritchell, of course, and Red Murph, being a Mets fan, knowing who Red Murph signed back in the 60s. And certainly, as the game has changed, the scouting has changed with it. Uh, Talk about like in back in the day when scouts were looking at players like Gehrig and Ruth. What how would they go about finding these players? Because now you have media and even the young teenagers are promoting themselves. Their parents are promoting them, but of course you didn't have that back in the early parts of the game.
But well, actually, just to clarify, I'm an Oriole fan who likes the Mets to the extent that it tries to compete with the Yankees. Although I have to admit, the biggest chapter in the book is about Yankee scouts because uh, while they had the advantage of Rupert willing to spend and the fact they won most of the time, the scouts were great and they were chosen. They went to the the back waters, and you have to realize that into the 50s, baseball was the only sport. It really was the national pastime. There was no pro basketball to emerge really until the 60s and then 70s. And even, the NBA finals were not on, they were on tape delay, I think, into the early 80s. And the NFL started with the boost of the Giant Colt game in 58. Uh, but in the heyday of baseball, kids who had athletic desire and loved the game, that it wasn't that hard to find them, but how to evaluate them, that was the key. And the Good Scout always looked into makeup, and that's one of that's one of the themes in the book, and that's so important for any future evaluation. I mean, how are players gonna how are kids at the age of 18 going to grow and learn to deal with the failure that's at the heart of the sport? And the Good Scout always had the network of the bird dog, who knew the families, and then the scouts, once they found that this fellow had athletic talent, well, then we see from the coaches and the principals in high school and the Legion coaches when American Legion ball was big, what are they like? And then ultimately you sign them, and that's where these stories get colorful and extremely important. And I hope after reading the book, some of these names will register because they certainly deserve to be remembered.
Continuing on that theme, is there a resource other than your book and a few other books like it that hail the scouts? Is there a resource that I would love to see a list of all the scouts and who they signed that made it to the majors. Does something like that exist?
Well, there is a book that was self-published called Feeling the Draft that's about the stories about all the not all, but many of the drafts, and a book that was absolutely essential to me in doing my research was the big Baseball America book on every draft from '65 up to I think it came out in 2017. And one of the fascinating things, and I get into it in this book, is how many people got drafted but didn't sign, and that's all in that great Baseball America green thick book. Uh, a beautiful example is Tom Greenway, who is is pictured when he was with the Dodgers, and Tom Greenwood for the Dodgers signed Rex Barney, and the pitcher who had a long career and became a coach with probably the greatest long name in baseball history, Calvin Coolidge, Julius Caesar, Tuskahoma, McGlish. Greenway also drafted for the Yankees Steve Rogers. But Steve Rogers, who became the great Expo pitcher and a Players Association leader, and now I think still works for the Players Association, Greenway and Rogers' family decided he wasn't ready, so he went to college instead. But and that's a fascinating part of that book. The number of people uh, that decide to go to college but were actually drafted by smart organizations. To me, though, the big problem, and where I have to admit I'm pessimistic about the future of baseball as a truly competitive industry, is that there's just not enough smart baseball people in baseball. I mean, just the Orioles are getting better. That's my team, and I saw Jackson Holiday play a couple of spring training games. Matt's 19-year-old son, who really looks like a comer, and he was the number one pick in the country. The Pirates, who are lagging, they don't spend. The Pirates picked shortly thereafter, and they picked a kid who's already out for the year. And yet, while you can't always predict injuries, the good scouts will always try to do the hardest thing, project what the future will be. And I remember I didn't get this in the book, but one of my first encounters with a baseball person when I started doing this work in the early '80s was Calvin Griffith. And Calvin Griffith, adopted son of Clark Griffith, the old fox of the Washington Senators. Before that, with the Highlanders and the Yankees. Calvin Griffith had just sold to the big banker Pohlad, so he was talking about how the Senators and then the Twins really developed good players. And Griffith said, "Well, I always look at a youngster's mouth, because if a teenager has bad mouth, how is he going to take care of his arm?" Now, a lot of people would find that, kind of cruelly paternalistic, but that's the way you go and evaluate this future dollar sign on the muscle, which is the phrase of Branch Rickey that also became the title of Kevin Corain's book that I'm I'm honored to follow in his footsteps in baseball's endangered species.
Talk a little bit about how methods have changed in the last, I don't even know how many years, but now that baseball is a much more international game with players coming from all over the world, whereas in the first part of the century it was just almost exclusively US born players. So how has that changed? I imagine it has expanded the numbers of scouts at least.
Well, very good questions, and I asked Joe McIlvaine about this, who's really one of the great scouts. Ran the Padres and the Mets, but his skill sets were not sufficient for the Wilpons. So Steve Phillips was hired instead. And McIlvaine said the two biggest changes he's seen, and I think he's absolutely right, is the weight training and the analytics. And the weight training, very Greg Maddox, most scouts will say would not have been signed today. I mean, he was not barely 6 feet, 150 pounds, but he had such an intelligence about his craft. I have a great story in the book from one of the scouts for the Cubs who had an amazing life in and out of baseball, John Cox. And John Cox told the story about how Maddox, when and the Met fans will remember this, Maddox came to the and it got bombed by the Mets one at Shea Stadium early in his career, and they told him, We're going to send you back for a little more AAA training, but go to Chicago first, settle in there, and then report to Indianapolis." And John Cox told the story that he goes on a scouting uh, uh, mission to Indianapolis, and he sees a guy in street clothes working in the bullpen, and he gets very concerned because uh, you can't be in street clothes in a bullpen. And it was Maddox who didn't go to Chicago. He was given money, a ticket to Chicago, but he went to Indianapolis and he said, "There's something wrong with my changeup, and I just have to get it right." And from then on, Maddox had yet to establish himself, but he had no doubt, the scout, that he was going to be what he was. And so now that the person that slight of size would not get, they're looking for the big man. And I remember McIlvaine also told me when he was playing, they told players not to swim because this motion might hurt the arm. Now there is weight training and to the excessive. I mean, so many injuries have occurred because of, I think, um, the uh, the weight training. Then the other thing is the analytics. I mean, and I'm not. I mean, early in the book, in the introduction, I quote Branch Rickey about Rickey was asked, "How much of baseball do you really know?" And he said, "Maybe 55%." And now, as somebody whose knowledge of this machine is pretty much I can click and move my computer so I can see you, Ron. But now you see guys in the dugout during games. They're not watching the game; they're watching their laptops. So that's another issue. And then in terms of the international scouting, uh, a big factor is it's cheaper labor. And that's been a big reason. Again, it was this good discussion I had with McIlvaine that the Dodgers were the first, and then the Braves that started the uh, academies, and now almost every team has an academy in Dominican Republic. Although with the cutting back, first of some of the minor league teams, 42 to be exact. I think they're cutting back some of the academies too, but that's where so many of the players are coming from, and uh, 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 and that's where the future of baseball to me is somewhat uncertain because there's so many more sports where you can get to the top and make the big money a lot quicker. So, but to sum up, the big changes are analytics and weight training and the desire to turn a game that by its nature is difficult, maddening, and unpredictable, trying to bring certainty into the game. And this is why, again, I was glad to bring back stories of people who didn't have the quote advantages, but knew and sought uh, players who could really develop and play this game.
Before we started the formal interview, you had mentioned that this is the first of several interviews you will be doing about the book. Uh, it comes out at a good timing because I know if you had published this a couple of years ago, you probably would not be going on appearances or having events because of COVID. So timing is everything, as the saying goes, and I know you're looking forward to getting out there. You know, speaking at the Hall of Fame is always a very fun venture. Speaking of the Hall of Fame, if you had to pick your Mount Rushmore of scouts, who would be on that facade?
Certainly Critchell, certainly Charlie Barrett. In fact, the first section of my book is about the stories of Ricky and Charlie Barrett, who was his first scout, first with the Browns and then with the Cardinals, and in a very eerie uh, bit of coincidence, Charlie Barrett died on the 4th of July, 1939, on the same day that Lou Gehrig gave the Hall of the luckiest man speech.
Hmm.
So those two would be right up there. I mean, Murph, who is the next chapter, and you want to talk about the amazing coincidences that if you hang around baseball. My first day in spring training last week, uh, I meet a man wearing an Orioles shirt who turns out to be from Texas, and Red Murph was his mentor. I mean, a man I met out of nowhere. And so Murph would be in there, and Paul Snyder, who's still with us, the man who served the Braves uh, for his whole career after coming up just short because of injury as a player. And so those are high up there, and of course Greenway, who was on the cover, and the not just for signing Mickey Mantle, but he signed Hank Bauer before that, and he got his start thanks to Lou Magulo, who was another scout who Tony Kubek gave me a great interview about because he was signed after doing a workout for the Yankees during in Chicago because Tony was a high school kid from Milwaukee and they met there for the weekend. So a lot of the Yankee scouts um, and Barrett and Howie Hake and who played for Ricky as a catcher in the minor leagues and then became his top Latin American scout, first in Brooklyn and then with the Pirates. Howie Hake, who Haak, who didn't know any Spanish except the 4 words in Spanish that was the key to the Ricky method, which is throw hard, run fast, and we'll teach you the rest.
Hmm.
So that's a short list, and there are, and I think from what I've read and meeting her, I think Kelly Rodman was on her way to becoming a great one herself. And the first scout I knew, who is also in my book, Billy Blitzer, who signed Sean Dunston, and maybe his greatest was Jamie Moyer, who he signed as a sixth round sixth round draftee for the Cubs.
Going back just a minute to the women in the game, what can you tell us about scouting for the All American Girls League?
That's a very good question, and I shook John Lovitz's hand once when I met him at the tennis in Queens because I thought he did an awfully good job as the scout. He in uh, uh, a league of their own. Um, the I Wrigley, Phil Wrigley, and invested a lot in that league. And Max Carey, who I believe the Veterans Committee voted into the Hall of Fame. Max Carey was a big coach and a big supporter of the women's league. So I think he's a key person in that story as well. And I always tell people because I enjoyed A League of Their Own so much, but you got to see the whole film through the credits because when they show those feisty women playing in in the old timers game, you get a sense of how competitive they really were.
Was there any one thing that stands out in your mind that came on as a real surprise when researching this book?
Well, yeah, I grew up thanks to my father, who was a New York Giant fan and never really accustomed himself to the Yankees taking over. I really grew to respect a lot of the Yankee scouts. I mean, and how they did, and then Joe Devine, for instance, who before he joined the Yankees and was big in telling Rupert and Barrow that Joe DiMaggio's knee injury in high school that may have come on a night of drinking. No one knows exactly how he hurt his knee, but they took him to a doctor in LA and they said he will heal. I mean, Divine and Divine then became uh, a an incredible source for the Yankee talent that came out of California, like like Jerry Coleman and Bobby Brown. So and before he joined the Yankees, Joe Devine signed in less than a year for the Pittsburgh Pirates. Archie Vaughan, both Wayner brothers, and Joe Cronin, who wound up becoming a star later with Washington and Boston. So I've really got to respect the Yankees scouts a lot, and the other Ricky scouts beyond Barrett. I mean, one of my favorites is Dr. Charles Chapman, who, having been a college professor at times, Charles Chapman became a very renowned uh, uh, professor of Spanish history at Berkeley, but he became a wonderful associate scout by writing a letter to Ricky and saying, I'm tired of the American League beating the National League in the World Series. You're not scouting California, and so that's how he got a job scouting California and brought the Taylor Douthit and Chick Havey to the Cardinals. So, yeah, it's those stories from the old days that really caught my attention, and Muddy Rule, who never played for a Ricky team, but was signed out of out of the trolley leagues to St. Louis. Muddy Rule, the first uh, baseball player to get standing, who could argue before the Supreme Court, but he never was a practicing lawyer because he was the one that called catching the tools of ignorance. But he also had this great phrase that his son told to a writer not long ago that baseball was the best mix of skill and fate, human talent and human error we've been able to conceive. So it's these little gems I've found from digging into the scouts and talking to them that really has made this a joy, and now to share with you.
Well, it's certainly a joy to read. We've been talking with Lee Lowenfish, author of Baseball's Endangered Species, Inside the Craft of Scouting by Those Who Lived It. Lee, thanks very much for talking with us today, and best of luck during the season.
Thank you, Ron. It's always a pleasure, and keep up the great work you're doing.